Hi, everyone. It's the first snowy day in New England, and it is just so beautiful having this blanket of powder on the ground. And of course, I'm also very much feeling and reminded when I talk to people about our collective need for a touchstone for a common humanity. And this week, in seeking out transformative thinkers who remind us of that, I came across an article in the New York Times about Joni Mitchell and how there's actually this new series of archival recordings and interviews with her. And she reflects on a pivotal moment in her own songwriting, where she brought up from her personal life the experience of having born a daughter and having given her up for adoption, which became part of the song Little Green. And this moment in her songwriting and her approach to songwriting also coincided with her own artistry and how she transitioned from not only being a high, beautiful soprano, but incorporating lower tones in her singing and a raspiness in her singing to encompass both. I want to begin with the words that she used to describe this pivotal moment and why she chose to both write and perform in such an intimate way. And she says about that time, "I write a song with the optimism that people will be able to see themselves in it. Therefore, we have a common experience. But that's the only way I can justify writing as intimately as I do. I think it's only human, and then other humans will feel this." And that's certainly how I feel when I encounter a song that has that special touch of humanity or any piece of art or any piece of literature, that it's not only something I'm appreciating from the outside, but it's very much a mirror in which I see myself. And this week's Torah portion, Lekh, is particularly a story and a series of stories in which the Torah draws us into the sense of a mirror and draws us into this very human story about being the outsider, being a stranger in a strange land, and through that, having a window onto our own combination of both vulnerability as well as independence that we need to take in the world and its lessons and incorporate them in a new way. And of course, it is a pivotal story in our tradition because not only does it appeal to the inner sense of independence through that first charge, Lekh Lecha, not just go out, but go for yourself, as God calls to Avraham to leave Ur and head to the land of Canaan following God's direction. But it also says that if Abraham follows God, there's the promise for Nivrachu v'chal kol mishpachot ha'adama, that all of the families of the world, all of the clans of the world will be blessed through you if you follow this path. And so the story of Lekh Lecha, of Abraham going out on his own and being the stranger in the strange land and taking on these new laws, will not just be a great blessing for him and a spiritual communion for him, but the promise is that it will be for all humanity. But there's a great flaw in this vision and the way it's been presented in Jewish tradition, which is that it's not only the story of Avraham, but it's the story of Avraham and Sarah. And there's an approach that I read this week from a different thinker, from Savina Teubal, who was an early feminist pioneer, and particularly in the area of biblical criticism. She became a scholar of the ancient Near East and applied that to her understanding of Sarah. And what she says in her book, Sarah the Priestess, is that what we have in the Torah is evidence, scant evidence though it may be, or sketchy evidence though it may be, it's nevertheless very real evidence of a counter-narrative, or perhaps a hidden narrative to Abraham's story, in which Sarah doesn't just accompany Abraham, as she seems to do in the biblical text, but she is a person with her own autonomy, her own sense of power, and her own status as a priestess in Canaanite religion. We don't know exactly how, we don't know exactly what, but we have hints in the biblical narrative to her status. And so even though the Bible, in coming up with a new story, sought to suppress that narrative, it could never do so entirely. We see hints of it in the biblical story itself. So for example, her name Sarah automatically connotes that she is a person of authority, with real agency and temporal authority. Um, what we notice as readers in the story, in these stories in Genesis, is that Sarah is relatively silent. And there are times when she speaks up, but Teubal's claim here is that when she speaks up, it's not out of jealousy, it's not out of pain, and it's not out of anger. What she does each time she speaks up and protests to Abraham is to enjoin him to actually follow the precepts of Mesopotamian law that he was obligated to because of her status as a priestess. And even in the rabbinic interpretation of Sarah, the rabbis note, or rather they claim, that just like Moses, just like Abraham, and just like every prophet after them, she too had the gift of Ruach HaKodesh, of having direct communication from God, and so they called Sarah a prophet. And so we have the story of Lekh, where we have this clarion call into the self, into the sense of adventure and vulnerability. And I wonder what happens when we see this story and the stories that follow, along with the hidden narrative. It's as if we have two stories. We have the revealed story and the concealed story. And we lionize the revealed story, but what happens when we bring both of these stories together, the known and the unknown? Well, the story of Abraham, we have these stories that appear to be quite problematic, maybe even broken narratives. As Abraham passes off Sarah as his sister so that he can save his own life, as Abraham feels like he has no other choice but to banish Hagar and his son Ishmael from the family to what to them must have been near certain death. Of course, we have the story of the Akedah, which we'll look at in a couple of weeks, in which Abraham has to sacrifice Isaac at God's command. And all of these stories, in the context of the tradition, are made virtuous and shine a light on God's transcendent qualities. But I wonder what happens when we hold up these stories along with the hidden narrative, the revealed and the concealed, the celebrated and the repressed. And the sense that I have is that what we're ultimately left with is is a narrative that is both broken and whole at the same time. And that it's this combination of wholeness, or rather the aspiration for wholeness, and the very real brokenness that exists, that through this combination, that's really what generates insight. And that's what really generates the impetus for each of us to go deeper and see these stories as a mirror. And so it reminds me of the image in the Midrash and the rabbinic legends of how our spiritual ancestors made their journey from Sinai, not only with the whole tablets that Moses brought from the mountain, but the shattered tablets that he brought down as well when he came down from the mountain and witnessed the people worshiping the golden calf. The whole and the broken together add up to our aspiration for holiness. And so to encapsulate this sense of how we live our lives, looking at the Torah as a broken mirror, looking at the rest of humanity as a broken mirror through which we look for some hopeful and realistic wholeness, I want to leave you with the words of Joni Mitchell and from her song Little Green, which was about this experience in which she bore a daughter and then put her up for adoption. And so these are Joni Mitchell's words. Just a little green, like the color when the spring is born. There'll be crocuses to bring to school tomorrow. Just a little green, like the night when the northern lights perform. There'll be icicles and birthday clothes, and sometimes there'll be sorrow. I want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom, wishing you blessings and shalom during this time, hope and peace. Get out and vote if you haven't done so already. Thank you for tuning in. Shabbat Shalom.